Welcome to Christ Church, and welcome to this community conversation that we are hosting. I'm glad you're here tonight. We've done several of these types of gatherings, as you might remember, at the church. So we came together to look at the social development of children within the church, and are they hitting the goals? We looked at the legal changes of recreational marijuana in the state of Illinois and how to think through some of those issues. And tonight we're doing, for the first time, doing this in a virtual format. So we had talked with and invited Dr. Addy to join us later in the semester. And instead of delaying that further, just thought we would attempt to do this way. So thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight specifically is made possible by a grant that Christ Church received from the Carl Henry Center at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And so the Divinity School received a larger grant from the Templeton Foundation to look at the intersection of faith and science, and they awarded this year 6 different churches across the country. And so Christ Church received one of those grants, and we've had a focus group that have been getting together to consider what that means for our congregation. And in a few weeks, we'll have a sermon series. It'll be 3 weeks where we're looking at this specific topic of how science and faith are come in this intersection, how we think about those as Christians. So you can know that is coming your way. This is a part of that event, and there'll be other things connected to that grant. So we're thankful to the Henry Center for allowing us to be a part of that. The topic for tonight, in terms of living and leading in the anxious age that we are in, we all know there are healthy and unhealthy ways to navigate this moment. And so we're looking for some insights on how to think through those things and think well about that. So we're joined tonight by Dr. Nii Addy, who is a professor at Yale School of Medicine, and our senior pastor, Mike Woodruff. And in just a moment, Mike will be leading the conversation and the dialogue back and forth there. So just as a further introduction to Dr. Addy, our guest tonight, he is Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Molecular and Cellular Physiology. Dr. Addy, I don't know if I know what any of those words mean, but it sounds very impressive. So we're glad to have you here tonight. He's a Duke undergrad, and did a PhD in neuroscience from Yale as well. He also directs a federally funded lab where they're looking at the neurological basis of things like addiction and anxiety and substance abuse and those types of things. Dr. Addy also has spoken at and been a part of some initiatives with the Veritas Forum, with Lecrae, I know as well, with the NFL, some NFL players and those types of things. So he's been around a lot of different things. So it's a privilege and honor to have you here tonight with us. So just quick housekeeping things. We are going to be taking questions. So we'd love to hear from you, those who are viewing, in the chat feature. And so our team will be collecting those. And then after Mike and Dr. Addy spend a few minutes here, the first half hour plus going back and forth, we'll have a chance to take your questions. So please make sure you put those in the chat feature. We'll have a chance to get to those a little bit later on this evening. So for now, I'm going to sign off and let Mike you take it on from here.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben. And Dr. Addy, thanks for being here. Thank you
Pleasure.
for your important work. And I thought I'd start by helping people get to know you a little bit. As I mentioned yesterday on our phone call, I stalked you for a bit on the web, so I know all the things that Ben said. Impressive academic credentials, Duke and Yale, and you're a professor at the medical school with an expertise in neurobiology, and a focus, as I understand it, on addictions and depression and anxiety. And I know, by the way, in case others are wondering, I asked the name Nii, Dr. Nii Addy. Nii is from Ghana. Your parents were from Ghana. You were born in the States. So let me ask you to fill our listeners in here a bit more. Your interest is on how the brain works and how we can help it work better, either by using therapeutic approaches or various pharmacological approaches. So I guess the question is, how do you do that? What does your day look like? You told me, but I imagine people could think that you're dissecting human cadavers, or you're in a research lab, or you're reading books, you've got a clinical practice, a lot of different ways people could think you do what you do. So tell us what you do.
Great, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. But just wanted to say at the onset again how thankful I am for this opportunity to be involved, and to your church for really spearheading this in a lot of ways. I think this is a really important topic as we've been talking about over the years, and especially right now with everything that's going on with COVID. So I really applaud you all for putting this as front and center and really giving us this opportunity to be able to talk about this in a larger setting. So you did ask a great question in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis. There are a lot of different things that could encompass. What we're primarily focused on, again, is trying to understand what's happening in the brain in different mental states. So thinking particularly about things that happen in the brain when someone is maintaining a good mental state, and also even more so what happens when people are having mental health challenges. So as both Ben and you have mentioned, a lot of our work focuses on addiction, depression, and anxiety. And the work that we're doing primarily is in animal models, so in rats and mice. And our goal there is to really get a sense of what's happening in the brain and to see if there are different processes that we can identify and also processes that we can change to alleviate some symptoms associated with some of these mental health challenges. And again, the starting point for us is the animal models, but we also use our work to then inform clinical studies that will go and look at specific individuals who are struggling with these mental health challenges and think of new therapies that we could use to alleviate some of those symptoms. So one question that always comes up is, why would you be using animal models in the first place?
How many rats do you know that are depressed or anxious?
And that's a difficult question to answer at the onset. But what I always encourage people to think about is behaviors that are associated with different mental health challenges. So a lot of times, if I'm speaking in a group setting, ideally if we had been in a setting where all of us were in the same room together, I might ask folks in the audience to say, well, what types of behaviors do you think about when you think about addiction? Or what types of behaviors come to mind when you think about depression or anxiety? So people will say things like, someone who continues to use a drug despite the harm that it's having in their life or the harmful consequences of that. Or someone who's struggling with depression who may lose motivation to be engaged in their daily activities, that the feeling of malaise or sadness becomes incapacitating and really affects their motivation. Or even anxiety that can affect people from going about their daily activities and lead them to a place where they feel impaired in some of those things. And so what we're able to do is to try and mimic some of those behaviors in animal models. So in particular, one example that I can give is that rats and mice, they like things that are pleasurable, things that are sweet. What we can do is do a test where we see how much of a sweet solution will they drink. And if there are certain changes that happen in their brain, which we already know happen in humans, that can lead to depression, that can also lead the animals to drink less sucrose. We can also do things like look at their motivation to work for a specific reward that they really like. And if they're in a more quote unquote depressed state, they won't work as hard for that highly palatable reward, but they'll expend more effort for something that doesn't take as much work. Animals will also take drugs that people will take. So things like nicotine, cocaine, amphetamine, heroin. And we can look at their drug taking behavior. They also show withdrawal from some of those substances, and they show relapse behavior. So we're then able to see what are the underlying processes that allow them to slip into that relapse. Can we prevent some of that type of behavior by making certain manipulations in certain brain pathways that are thought to be important for some of these behaviors? So on a day-to-day basis, a lot of it is trying to think creatively about ways that we can set those experiments up. And then we're able to use a lot of different tools to look at brain activity, to look at brain chemistry, and to look at brain pathways that are engaged in some of these behaviors that we would consider to be maladaptive or associated with mental health challenges. Then we can see if we can reverse some of those processes to alleviate some of these symptoms.
So there is, this is a little humbling, but you're suggesting that my brain and yours are, that studying a rat's brain, a mouse's brain, is helpful to figure out how our brain is going to work.
Yes, that's definitely what I'm saying, because there are enough similarities between rodents' brains and our brains for us to get a sense. Now, you hint at the obvious underlying question there too, which is there are limitations as well. So clearly our brain is not the same as a rat brain. And in particular, one of the things that we talk about a lot is the frontal cortex, so the area in the front of our brain that's really important for some of our quote unquote higher order thinking. So our cognitive processes, and those types of higher order thinking processes that we use when we're doing analytical things. And so the rodents do have that as well. We are able to see some aspects of that brain activity that is still giving us insight into what might happen in the human brain, but there are distinct differences as well. But there are enough similarities to at least give us an initial sense.
Okay, so you are a scientist and you're doing a lot of work in a lab with animal models. You also identify as a Christ follower. Tell me a bit about that. Is that, did you grow up in a Christian family? Did you come to faith in college?
Yeah. So I did grow up in a Christian family. Both my parents moved to the States from Ghana, and they were both Christians before they came to the States. I would say early on in my life, my faith was something that I would say I took for granted, in terms of that was kind of the way things were. I kind of went about trying to be, I thought, I'm a pretty good person. I do my best. I try and treat other people well, those types of things. So that was kind of my framework early on growing up. I would say things shifted later on, probably middle school, high school. Even though I had already accepted Christ as my personal savior, I think my understanding was still kind of in that limited framework of, well, I'm a pretty good person and I'll just do my best to treat everybody well. The shift for me happened in high school, actually, when I was spending time in Chicago. So we were doing a lot of work in the mission field. So working with the homeless in Chicago, working in some areas of the city that had challenges with gangs and things like that. And I was really impressed by the folks who were working in those areas, who had left the area, had moved on and gotten well-paying jobs in other areas, but felt God calling them back to really serve the city. I also remember meeting a homeless individual who was also someone who professed that he was a Christian, who would give away half of his food every morning. So having these personal stories really struck me as this was something where people weren't just trying to be good people, but there seemed to be something on a much deeper level in terms of their interaction or relationship with God that was driving them to behave the way they did. And so for me, that was a really big challenging point, to really kind of step back and have more of an understanding of having a relationship with God rather than just trying to do everything on my own.
So is it, are your science colleagues more surprised by your faith in Christ, or are your church friends more surprised by your scientific endeavors? I mean, those don't always, there's often some tension there. So you're living that. How does that play out?
So I'd say early on, especially when I was in grad school, I think my science friends were surprised, were the ones who were the most surprised. I remember one story in particular. We had a student in the lab that I was working in, visiting from England. And I remember, I'd gotten to know him over a few months, and I think he had respected me as a scientist. And then one day he found out that I was also a Christian, and his jaw just dropped, basically. He just couldn't reconcile how somebody he respected as a scientist could also be a Christian. For him, those two worlds just couldn't coexist, which obviously hadn't been my experience up to that point. I've seen some of that from the church side as well, maybe not as much, but where people are surprised by the work that we do in the lab and also wonder if the two can reconcile. But for me, it hasn't been a point of huge tension. I feel that science answers certain questions, and we ultimately think about as Christians who the creator behind all this is, but the science doesn't answer the who, but it's still letting us try to understand the what and some of the hows. So for me, it's been something that I think God has given me a gift to be able to study his creation and learn more about it. And it actually shows me and gives me even a bigger appreciation of awe and wonder for the complexity of his creation.
Yeah, great. Well, lots of questions I'd like to ask there, but I want to stay on our assignment here. And I want to ask, I want to sort of shift into some questions about society at large and in the last few years. But before I do that, perhaps we need to define a couple terms. I think we all have working definitions of some of these words, but you're the expert. So first term, mental health. What is it? What is mental health, or what is mental illness?
So mental health, I tend to use in the very broadest sense, and just thinking about how we go about our daily lives in terms of our brain and engagement with society, with our family, our friends, and our loved ones. And so even though at the beginning I was talking a lot about the biological basis of mental health and what we do in the lab, I would say that definition by itself is too narrow. So we also think about psychological components that influence how we interact with others and think about ourselves and the world around us. We also think about, socioeconomic aspects that can influence that, cultural aspects, and spiritual aspects. Now, in terms of thinking about mental illness, I tend to define that as challenges that would impair us from being able to engage in those types of things on a daily basis in a well-functioning way. So they're intertwined in a lot of ways, but mental illness, I would say, is when some of those things go awry and make it difficult for us to interact in the world with the world around us.
So I think I know what you'll say here, but let's take depression. And so the next word I'd like you to define is depression. And there are times when depression is, I would argue, is the appropriate response.
Mm-hmm.
But there are times when depression is a crippling response.
Mm-hmm.
So what is depression, and at what point is depression mental illness?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of time, if you talk to psychologists and clinicians for things like depression, this also extends to things like anxiety. The criteria and the diagnostic, the DSM, often has to do with how long those feelings persist. So for instance, with depression or anxiety, it won't be diagnosed necessarily as clinical until it's persisted for a certain period of time, or for a prolonged period of time. And also if it's impairing, again, people's day-to-day activity. But as you mentioned, we all have periods of sadness and difficulty coping with things or difficulty processing things. And that's natural. And that's the way that our brains were designed. The issue becomes when that becomes prolonged or people are stuck in that mode and can't go about their daily functions.
Okay, so one more sort of background question here. What constitutes an addiction?
Right. So that's another one where it has to do sometimes with the length of time and then also with the number of symptoms that are associated with it. So diagnostically, people will sometimes, and this has shifted a bit over time, but talk about different degrees of addiction, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe. So there are 11 different characteristics that come into that diagnosis. Some of these include things like craving. One of them is continuing to use more of the drug than people originally intended, or continuing to use a drug if there are even when there are physical harms associated with that, or psychological harms, or it's influencing people's family and work. So a lot of times, again, it depends on how long that is used for and how severe it is. So sometimes if people have 1 to 3 different symptoms, that might be considered mild, 4 to 6 more moderate, and 6 or more of the 11 is considered severe addiction.
Okay, so is the addiction, if I have an addiction to alcohol or an addiction
Mm-hmm.
to heroin, can you, because I think of you as primarily, in terms of your research,
Mm-hmm.
focusing on sort of the neurobiological side of this,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to therapeutic, as opposed to arguing and studying how friendships or how counseling or how
Mm-hmm.
silence or spiritual habits affect the brain.
Mm-hmm.
You're a scientist, you're in the lab, you're looking more at chemical situations. So could you look at my brain, if I'm an addict, could you look at my brain and say, I see addiction there? I mean, does it show up morphologically? Could you measure it in terms of, I don't know, pH or brain waves or
Mm-hmm.
chemicals? What exactly? I mean, I sort of know what an addiction is. I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure out what a brain scientist says an addiction.
Right. So that's a great question. So there's not necessarily a diagnostic feature from a brain image that people would look at. Although some people have started to try and do that a little bit more. But there are certain features that will typically show up. So one of the neurotransmitters in the brain that people talk a lot about that's involved in reward and also how we process things associated with rewards is dopamine. And so dopamine is a chemical messenger in the brain. So it allows neurons, the brain cells, to talk with each other. And they do this by also binding to specific proteins in the brain called receptors. And so some of the work that people have done is to look at individuals who struggled with addiction for a long time, and they have changes in the levels of their dopamine receptors. Part of that likely has to do with the fact that their brains have been barraged with drugs of abuse over long periods of time. So that's one type of characteristic that comes up. Another thing that we talked about, we mentioned a little bit earlier, was the frontal cortex, so the area of our brain in the front. And that's involved in higher cognitive processing, but it's also involved in inhibitory control. So when we see something that we might want to do, but we know that we shouldn't, or something that might be harmful to us. So sometimes people who are struggling with addiction also have decreased activity in their frontal cortex, which would suggest that they have less inhibitory control. The challenge there is knowing whether that inhibitory control came first and made it more likely for those individuals to slip into addiction, or if that lack of inhibitory control was a consequence of the drug use. But to get to your question, there are certain characteristics that we can look at that give us some insight into what a quote unquote addicted brain looks like.
Okay, so you said a lot there, and I want to go to some of it, but let me just take a couple more things in a general order. So I think if I were to ask the average person on the street if they thought that mental health challenges were increasing, and this is before COVID, this is, over the course of the last few years, they would say, yes, it seems as though more people are depressed. This is an average person on the street would say, yeah, I hear of more people taking antidepressants, or I know that people are more anxious, or it seems as though I keep hearing that young people are less resilient. And as a pastor, and this is all anecdotally, I don't know what the neuroscientists say. As a pastor, I would say 30 years ago, I knew when I was dealing with some mentally ill people, there were homeless people. We had a lot, tragically, of Vietnam vets that were now, I would say, had PTSD. I didn't know that language then. I don't know if others were using it. But there were people that were mentally ill, borderline psychotic, and I knew they were, and I'd interact with them. There was a handful of people. Today, as a pastor, I feel like I'm around people who have mental health issues a lot. So would you agree that depression and anxiety and addictive behavior is growing, or is that just we're more aware of it?
I would say it's probably a little bit of both. So I would say we are definitely more aware of it, and I would say that's a good thing because that allows people to get the help they need. So numerous stories from people in previous generations who said that they noticed ex-family member acting this way, ex-friend acting this way, but no one really ever did anything about it. Sometimes those people would be better over time. Sometimes, unfortunately, things wouldn't get better, and then people weren't really able to live their life to the fullest in that sense. So I think in some ways we have gotten better in recognizing those things, and some of that has had to do with decreasing the stigma to make sure that those folks are getting the help that they need. But it also does seem like there's an increased rate of some of these mental health challenges. And one of the clearest examples that a lot of people cite is the increase in suicide rates, which has been steadily climbing between 1% to 4% a year since about 1999. Now, some of that probably is also due to underreporting previously, and some of that underreporting may still occur, but there are likely individuals beforehand who were unfortunately dying due to death by suicide, but that wasn't necessarily divulged or captured in the statistics. So my sense is that it's likely both that are happening simultaneously.
So let's go with the idea that it's increasing. I certainly, I've shared before in other groups that I was about 30 when I realized, oh, my grandfather was mentally ill. Like, that's what that was. nobody told me that.
Mhm.
And it wasn't, just wasn't talked about. But at some point I realized, oh, he had a mental illness. I don't know what it is, but clearly that was the case. And I was a kid, and so people didn't, they didn't tell a kid that. But I get that it was there and we didn't talk about it as much. But let's assume suicide is up and it feels like all these studies suggest that people are more anxious. Why are they more anxious? I mean, is it, I hear, well, screens are rewiring people's brains, or parents, they don't let kids fail enough, or there's hormones in the milk and there's toxins in the environment. Do you have is there any sort of emerging scientifically accepted sense of why people are more anxious or depressed?
There are a fair number of studies that have been done, and there's some common themes that run through them, even though I would say that a lot of that data is still emerging. But one key piece of it is that it seems to be isolation, and that in a sense is unfortunate given the circumstance that we're in now with COVID. So people have done reports, and you do see increased rates of individuals saying that they're lonely, or that people are feel like they're not as connected with people. And that's coming in the midst of all the social media that we have that is theoretically intended to connect individuals together. So I think some of that can be a false sense of connectedness that can happen through the use of social media. And so there is still that need for, in-person contact and relationship building, which obviously is a stretch right now with everything that's happening with COVID. And that may shift a bit now that we're in this COVID season where the social media is all a lot of us have, and people are starting to be creative about ways to try and still incorporate aspects of what was there with in-person contact that's now moved to social media. But even that literature, some of it is mixed. Some studies will come out and say that, there's a correlation between how much time teens spend on social media and how depressed or anxious they are. Others might come out and say that doesn't seem to be as strong of a correlation. So I think some of that is still emerging, but that theme of that feeling of isolation or loneliness does seem to be increasing. And I think it's important for us to think about why that is.
So let me ask a specific question about anxiety, because yes, obviously, and again, I come at this as a pastor, not as a scientist. I see the statistics about how many people are increasingly anxious about their job or about their health, and I think, yes, we're isolating everybody, and it feels like when people can come out, we're going to find that some people have been doing really well, and others have fallen deeper into depression or anxiety or addictive behavior or abuse, and so it's a little unnerving, but I still, you're a scientist, so help me understand, when somebody is anxious, what exactly is happening so I can understand how you're trying to help. So 20 years ago, I am getting on an elevator that I've been on many times, and I'm not thinking anything about it. I'm the only one on the elevator. As the door starts to close, suddenly panic. I can't be on this elevator. And I lunge and I stick my hand as the door's closing and it opens up, and I get off the elevator, and I'm anxious. I'm breathing deeply, and I'm going, oh my goodness, and I'm thinking, this elevator's going to crash. I've got to get off this elevator. So I walk up the steps. It's like, it was not a small number of steps. I walk up the steps and go on my day. The next day, same thing happens, and I walk up the steps. The third day, same thing happens, and I said, okay, this is crazy. I cannot walk up 8 flights of steps or 80 flights of steps every day. I have got to face this. So I just said, something's going on. You're anxious, something's triggering something in your brain. You just have to thoughtfully pray your way through this, get on this elevator, ride it. I didn't have the language to talk about, acclimating or whatever you might say. But, now I will say this, I called my brothers because they both work for an elevator company and asked them what the chances are that an elevator could crash. And I then pointed out that I had no problems with elevators until I realized they were making them. And then I was panicked. So I tried to blame them for this, but I'm fine. I haven't had it happen again. But what happened? I mean, why was I suddenly panicked? What was going on in my brain?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are specific areas of the brain that are important for getting us worked up. And so a lot of times people will talk about the fight or flight response that's in certain emotional areas of the brain. The amygdala is one of those areas that comes to mind. There are others that are integrated with that as well. But for instance, you can imagine the feeling that you had on the elevator that when you felt that panic and tried to dart out of it. You can also imagine times when that would be very adaptive for you to feel. So let's say you've been walking across the street and a car was coming near you and was about to hit you. You'd want to have that exact same response so you could get out of the way and not lose your life, clearly. But in that elevator setting, that wouldn't be necessary. So part of what happens in your brain that allows you to have that quick response, to have the adrenaline kick in, to activate your muscles and to help you get to safety, can sometimes happen in inappropriate settings, like you talked about in that elevator. The other piece which you touched on is the fact that when those things happen, there are areas of our brain that change over time. So a lot of times people talk about plasticity, and that's thought to be important for our learning. So let's say you had that response when you were in the elevator, you went back the next day and you had that response again. You're starting to go through a process called conditioning, where your brain is now starting to associate those cues and that environment with those feelings that you had. And so it becomes more and more, quote unquote, hardwired into your brain. That's not to say that that can't change, but the more times that you experience that, the stronger those associations become. And so sometimes it becomes just being exposed to the cue itself that can trigger, as you mentioned, I think you used the word trigger, can trigger that response in your brain and in your body.
I'd really like it if you would blame my brothers for this. I mean, that would just...
That piece can be there as well. So that was an interesting piece in the story that you shared, because sometimes, so people will do things when they're going through therapy called exposure therapy, where they'll go back to that same environment and then start to inform themselves with other pieces of information. So getting that feedback from your brothers, let's say they had told you that, you know, there's a 0.00001% chance that the elevator will have an accident. That can become incorporated into your thought process, and that can help you get through that. And again, that has to do with that prefrontal cortex piece I was talking about before. And the prefrontal cortex is actually connected to the amygdala. So sometimes having those thoughts of different thoughts in the prefrontal cortex can, quote unquote, turn down the signal in our amygdala that gives us that fight or flight response and allow us to cognitively override that response. So a lot of times that is what will actually happen when people are doing therapy. They're engaging other areas of their brain, engaging some of those responses and retraining their minds in a sense to not have that panic response in that situation.
Okay. So I've got a couple more questions. I just want to remind those that are people that are listening that they can send in questions. And I know we've had some that have been sent in. But let me sort of stair step us into some of the other questions that I see coming in. Mm-hmm. Again, you come at all of this as a neurobiological scientist. But I hear you talking about these other therapies. So are you a fan of other therapies? And I'm going to ask you that as a scientist first, and then I'm going to ask some questions about some of the spiritual habits and practices that we get encouraged to do, like silence and meditation and prayer and community and some of that. But before I ask Nii Addy as a Christ follower, let me ask Nii Addy as a neuroscientist. So I think of the whole psychopharmacological arena, and then I think of all these other approaches. I don't know that that's the right division, but I think of therapy, talking with somebody, changing my diet, sleep, all kinds of other things. So are you a fan of other things, or you think your way is best? I mean, talk to me.
So yeah, I would say I'm a fan of other things. I would also acknowledge that I'm biased because I tend to think about the brain as an output for a lot. So one example I can give you, we talked about, being in community with other individuals or having those interactions. So even when we're doing our rodent studies, you can see the benefit of that. So if you have rodents in isolation, so in isolated housing, they're much more likely to take the drugs. They're much more likely to have a depressive-like phenotype. If you put them together in groups, they're much less likely to take the drug and much less likely to have that depressive phenotype. So even scientifically, you can see the power of being in community with others. And we can also see specific changes in the brain that happen when they're in community. So I would say that all these different components are still important. None of them should happen in isolation. But in my biased neuroscientist mindset or framework, I would often be looking to what's happening in the brain that all these other types of interventions are touching upon. So whether that's a psychological intervention that might be changing the brain, or a thought pattern, or new cognitive therapies that also will influence how the brain responds in certain situations. And that extends to a lot of different things. Exercise also has demonstrated effects on the brain, can be protective against depression. And there have been studies that have looked at what happens in the brain after exercise that makes it protective for things like depression. Sleep is also important. So yeah, I say I'm a fan of all those pieces. And my neuroscience framework is always trying to figure out what are those different pieces doing in the brain that makes them effective.
Okay, so what does the neuroscientist say about the therapeutic, and I'm going to say therapeutic as opposed to spiritual, the therapeutic benefit of prayer or scripture reading or worship or fasting, any of the spiritual habits?
Mm-hmm. Well, the neuroscientist side would say that all those things are important because they help us and help our brains focus on something else. So for instance, some of the things that are consistent across different mental health challenges is this idea of, being stuck on a certain thought pattern or ruminating on something over and over. That happens with anxiety as well. So, if someone is trying to deal with anxiety, they may be mentally attending to all the things that are happening in their body, their increased pulse rate, they're feeling sweaty, and all those things are kind of contributing to the anxious feeling that they're having, or things with depression where people can get into a mindset of a negative outlook on everything. So even from that standpoint of focusing on something else, focusing on something outside ourselves can be beneficial for our brains and can also be beneficial in terms of dealing with some of these symptoms. So things like prayer, it takes the onus off of us in a sense and allows us to focus on something else outside of ourselves. But even things like meditation. So people have done studies to just look at the importance of just taking time to breathe and being mindful and focusing on our breath. All these things shift our focus from the thing that we may be worrying about to something else, and also allows us to calm ourselves in a lot of ways.
Okay. So let me ask one more question, and then I'm actually going to ask you to give me a grade. I'm sort of curious as to what kind of grade Mike Woodruff would get if I was I guess you only have medical students. I'm not sure, but here's my approach. I don't do a lot of counseling with people. It's not something I feel like I'm particularly good at, but I get called into some situations. And so people will come in and say, for instance, I'm depressed. I'm really sad. I don't have much energy. I don't, I'm not eating well. I'm not sleeping, or I'm sleeping all the time. And I'll say, well, tell me what's going on. And they describe things. And a lot of times I say, wow, I actually think you should be depressed. I mean, there's so many bad things going on in your life. And I think the fact that you're sad is a reflection that your heart is working and you're engaged with a lot of sadness in your life, and you've got to grieve. And let's talk about that. If it doesn't immediately make sense to me, I generally will try and encourage them to go see a doctor and say, well, let's just rule something more physiological out. I don't know, maybe you're sick or you've got a thyroid issue or something else. Let's do that. And I'm very clear if they're on meds. A line that I use that I heard from somebody else is the only medication, and I'm thinking here of antidepressants or something like that. The only medication I'm going to encourage you to stop taking is the medication that I prescribed in the first place. And since I don't prescribe any medication, I'm sort of making the point that I'm not going to encourage you to go off. Now, I do tend to think that some people medicate too quickly. And I think there can be value in being sad and in learning how to process these things. I get that I believe there is a value in psychopharmacological approaches to this, but so I don't discourage medication, but I also want to encourage people in these historic spiritual practices of journaling and more time with friends and Sabbath rest and some of these things that I think are ways to be more introspective and to have, the ultimate goal isn't mental health. It's obviously a goal along the pathway, but to live a better life. So how would you respond? What grade Dr. Addy, what grade do I get on my final exam here?
That one I'm going to give you an A-.
Okay, well, I'll take it.
No, I think it's a really. Oh, go ahead.
I don't think anybody would give my counseling skills an A-, so I'll take it from you. And next time I'm being criticized on this front, I'll say, hey, I got an A- from the Yale Med School professor.
There are a couple different pieces in there that I really liked. So one, the fact that you're having people just come and talk, because oftentimes that's a first step intervention. And you're also validating what people are going through. And that can be really important. I think another underlying piece is that you already have an inherent level of trust that's built between you and the person that's sharing with you. And then you're also trying to help people just be realistic about what else might be going on. But I think the fact that you're naming and validating those feelings is a really critical first step. And as you mentioned, the goal, so these are natural responses that we have. And so the goal is not to avoid feelings and not to avoid things that are challenging or depressing, but more so to be able to experience those, but to be able to move through them. So a lot of times some of the interventions, some of the psychological interventions that people go through in therapy, for instance, when dealing with anxiety, is to quote unquote avoid avoidance. Because a lot of times that makes things worse. So if someone has a situation that causes high anxiety, the more they avoid it, the more likely it will cause anxiety the next time they actually run into it. And so there's a period where people are taught and helped to not avoid that situation, and then to learn that they can actually ride out the anxiety and that it can eventually pass. So, sometimes, as we've talked about before, sometimes some individuals might need medication to get over that hump. Others may not. For others, just having a time of prayer, a time of self-reflection, journaling, all these different tools that you mentioned, and even the spiritual tools, can help people deal with those challenges and get over that hump with depression as well. But again, as we mentioned with depression, sometimes that will persist for long periods of time. So I think the other wise thing that you mentioned is that you don't leave it just at yourself. So if someone is incorporating some of those practices and is still depressed, you're not telling them that it's because they're not praying hard enough, they don't have enough faith. You're directing them to say, well, let's take advantage of these other tools that we have, that God has given us, that we have learned about the brain, and see if there is something else underlying that may be contributing to this depression. So all those things were the reason for your high grade.
Okay, good. Well, so there's a number of questions that have come in, and I want to say, if you can answer these questions in 1 minute. So I'm not going to grade you on your answers to these questions. So
Fair enough.
I want to get through as many of these as I can.
Mm-hmm.
And so quick answers. Would you consider ketamine a breakthrough therapy for depression?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
I can illuminate why. It's much more rapid acting than the antidepressants that we've had for the last 50 years.
Okay. So what is your take on the recent studies with LSD to treat addictions and depression?
So to be honest, that's not something that I've looked into heavily. So I'd have to check into that and see. I just off the top of my head, I would say the challenge there is always liability in terms of how addicting it could be. And that has even come up with ketamine a little bit as well, just because it's close to some of the other substances that can be abused. So that'd be my only hesitation there.
Okay. Is resilience a learned behavior?
I would say, yeah, I say it can be a learned behavior, but it can also be different at baseline. So some individuals, for whatever reason, seem to have a higher level of resilience than others. But yes, I think it can be learned.
Is it possible to model PTSD in animals?
There are ways that people are trying to model it. I think each model has its own benefits and downsides. So I'd say at the best, we're able to model certain aspects of it, but there's no perfect model that encapsulates every component of PTSD.
Okay. What variables, you're getting a high grade, by the way, Dr. Addy. We're moving our way down this list. What variables are you looking for to determine when a coping mechanism, such as exercise, shopping, alcohol, etc., moves from being healthy to being unhealthy?
So I'd say it becomes unhealthy when it causes disruptions to the person's life, either their personal life or the life of their family members or loved ones. And then when it impairs them. So if they're no longer keeping their job responsibilities, keeping their school responsibilities, causing physical harm to themselves or psychological harm to themselves, that's when I would consider it crossing that threshold.
Okay. So during this during the COVID time, I have been exercising more, and I'm exercising perhaps a little bit too much. I'm acting like I'm 25, not like I'm older than 25. So yeah, I've started to wonder at what point is this just foolishness on my part, but oh well. So here's a question for you. I'm a Christ follower and a PhD student studying disease ecology, and I often feel like my faith is in super stealth mode. How do you work to spread the light of Christ through your work while maintaining your credibility in the scientific community?
That's a great question. I would say that's something I've been developing over time, and it's been a little bit of trial and error as well. So I think earlier on, I don't know if I would necessarily have called it stealth mode, but that wasn't something I would necessarily advertise. But I did still try to have important one-on-one conversations with people to let them know my framework. But I also tried to at least instill and use all the biblical principles about doing my work to the highest standard as if working for Christ. So at least in that sense, people weren't going to come and critique me for being lazy or, only doing my work halfway. So at least from that sense, I felt like as a representative of Christ in a scientific setting, I also had a biblical mandate to maintain that level of excellence while also being true to my calling as a Christian and just letting that come through. And that's opened lots of doors in terms of conversations down the road as well.
So as I understand it, you're a professor, so you're doing research, but you're giving lectures. You have students,
Mm-hmm.
PhD students, medical students, undergrad students, everybody?
Yeah, so within the lab itself, I have PhD students and undergraduate students, and then also postdoctoral fellows who've already earned their PhDs. But then I also team teach some courses here and there. So I've team taught a class for PhD students, and I also lecture to the medical students, specifically on the addiction components. So yeah, I have lots of student contacts through different settings.
Okay, so what would you say to, I'm sort of going to spin this a little bit, but what would you say to, as a professor, to students that are either Christ followers and that's coming up in their understanding of mental health and addictions and everything else, or the way they're framing it, or to people who bring an anti-faith bias to anxiety and depression and everything else?
Mm-hmm. So I would, what would I say in terms of their framework for their work?
How do you coach either kind of student?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of, I'll use the lab example as a starting point. So in terms of the lab environment, a lot of that would be the same because the principles in place are still principles that I would expect of individuals to be able to maintain their integrity in carrying out their work, and then also to look at the evidence. So the evidence in terms of what's the data that we're collecting and what is it telling us about the brain and what is it telling us about how that influences mental health. So a lot of times when people think about that in terms of their faith background, whether they're a Christian or have a different faith or someone that would say they don't have a faith, I would actually encourage the same principle. So what is the evidence telling you? And those are conversations I also had when I was in some of my training. So I'd be in conversations with people, about my faith and still being a scientist. And we would just talk about our perspectives on things and basically just talk about what's the evidence for or against faith. And so in those circumstances, I really try to encourage people to be honest with themselves and to be authentic and to deeply investigate and to find truth. Because I think science is about trying to find the truth of what underlies these processes in the same way that when we're thinking about our worldview, it's about truth as well. And I believe that I found that in Christ, that God revealed that to us, but I also encourage people to do that in how they approach their lives and how they approach their science as well.
Okay. Is anxiety genetic?
Yes and no. I know that's that seems like an unsatisfying answer, but with a lot of these things, there are genetic components that contribute, but there's also environmental components that can contribute as well. So some illnesses are more genetically driven than others. The challenge is that even within one specific illness, there can be subsets that are more genetically driven than other subsets. So for instance, with nicotine addiction, there are some individuals that have a certain genetic code that makes them much more likely to become dependent on cigarettes if they use them. But that doesn't mean that everyone who uses cigarettes necessarily has to have that genetic susceptibility.
So do you have rats or mice that you would say, looking at them, are depressed naturally? They have a depressive personality. And how do you go about measuring depression and anxiety and this would be I'm looking for a short answer here because I want to be sensitive to the time.
Yeah, so I would say for the first part, yes, that is true. So we can use certain exposures where some of the animals will look resilient and some of them will look depressed. And so that's a baseline. That's before we've done anything to try and change any brain processing. So that comes out at the beginning. Some of the things we'll do in terms of looking at depression are similar to what you would think about in humans. A lot of times people are depressed because things are unpredictable. So COVID is a great example of that. There's a lot of unknown that's associated with it. We can't see the virus. It's hard to know sometimes if you've contracted it because people can be asymptomatic. And so a lot of those things can lead to anxiety. Sometimes for the animals, they'll try and do things where there'll be mild stressors that are unpredicted, and that will lead to a more quote unquote depressed state where they'll have a lack of motivation. And again, allows us to look at some of these things. Sometimes we'll also mimic what's happened in people. So there are individuals who are exposed to certain pesticides that increased acetylcholine, which is another neurotransmitter in the brain, and that caused depression in those individuals. We can use that same agent in animals to get that depressed state and see how we can reverse it.
Okay. Again, back to rapid fire. Do you have an opinion about recreational marijuana?
I do. I should
What
share
is your opinion about marijuana?
Go ahead.
What is your opinion about recreational?
My opinion is that there's been a lot of conversation, but the conversations aren't always fully informed. So one of the pieces that doesn't come out much is the fact that, so there are different components to marijuana. The cannabidiol, which is the component that can have some health benefits, and also the THC, which is the one that's hallucinogenic, so causes euphoria, causes people to have a high. What people don't talk about much is the THC content in today's marijuana is about 30 times, if I'm remembering correctly, 30 times more potent than that from decades past. And so a lot of the framework is based on quote unquote older versions of marijuana. And we don't really have a clear sense of what this high THC content will do long term. So I think that's something that needs to be considered. There's also a link between THC exposure and psychosis. So that's something that could lead people into schizophrenia. It's not clear if people who use marijuana are more likely to develop that psychosis or if it's because of the THC. So I feel like those two pieces sometimes get left out of the conversation. And I think it's important for that to be integrated before we jump to things too quickly.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard it's a very complicated substance. So three final questions here. So where are we headed? And there's two questions here. One is, so my observation, if I go to an orthopedic surgeon, he takes pictures and says, you definitely broke your leg or you tore your meniscus and we're going to fix it. And when I am observing psychiatrists interacting, I hear, well, I think it's a personality disorder. It might be that there's some bipolar going on, or it might be depression. And I find myself interacting with people that are walking alongside people that are going through this saying, okay, I know that you're drinking a lot, or I know that you're smoking a lot of marijuana. And I can't figure out, are you smoking the marijuana because you're depressed? Or are you depressed because you're smoking the marijuana, right? Is this just self-medicating, or is this contributing? And so when I look on, I see the field of neuroscience as being, wow, it's nothing like getting an x-ray and going to an orthopedist and having them fix the bone. Are we getting a lot better at this? Do you expect we're going to be a lot better in 50 years?
We're getting better. I don't know if I'd say we're getting a lot better or sufficiently better. And you've hit on some of the reasons that is still a challenge. Just because, and then again, some people are trying to do this to have diagnostic types of images they can do. The challenge for us is that we're still trying to identify what people would call biomarkers that would allow us to be able to say, if you have this change, then you have this illness. Part of the challenge for us has to do with the way that we categorize mental health challenges. So one example I always like to give, this was from a psychiatrist and researcher at Duke, who was talking about patients that he sees who come in for depression. And sometimes you get completely opposite symptoms. So some people might be depressed and sleep a lot less. Some people might be depressed and sleep a lot more. Some will eat a lot less, some will eat a lot more, but that all gets lumped into the category of depression. The challenge for us as a field is that those may be two different brain bases that are leading to those different symptoms. So let's say there's a change in pathway A that's causing this person to sleep more and be depressed, and a change in pathway B that's causing this person to sleep less. But now what we've done is say, oh, that's all depression, we're going to treat it all the same way. That may only be effective for half those individuals. So we're still really trying to understand if we're trying to think about at least treating things from a brain perspective, what's happening in the brain that's allowing that to occur. Some of the psychological interventions are a little bit better in that sense, because you're really dealing with sometimes the thought process or the cognition or the behavior more so than trying to focus on the underlying biological component. And that might be a better intervention for some, but there's so many different ways that each of these things are approached. It's still a challenge.
Okay. Your penultimate question here. In 100 years, will we be taking more psychopharmacological drugs or less?
My hunch would be more, and I'm taking that. So I'm thinking backwards 100 years and thinking about the medications that we take for our other ailments that are outside of the brain. Because a lot of times what I try and think about is, if this is a brain disease, we're also in some ways going to be treating it just like we treat body disease. And some of that can be preventative. So I'll use aspirin as an example. So, individuals over a certain age who may be susceptible to heart issues will be taking aspirin under the advice of their cardiologist to try and help things be preventative. I imagine that is going to continue and will also include things related to the brain. But then there's also a risk associated with that too, because you don't want to go into things prematurely and have people on agents when they don't need to be. For instance, when some of that could just be addressed in terms of changing our environment or how we think about things.
Okay. So I'm gonna end this, and I'll say to all the listeners here that we'll send out an email with some links to Dr. Addy's the things that he's written and organizations that he's working with and recommending and other things like that. So maybe I'll just frame it with this person. So a woman writes, during this time as a nurse in a COVID ICU, I find myself more in a depressed state and anxious for all the obvious reasons. What do you, Dr. Nii Addy, a neuroscientist, and what do you, Nii Addy, a Christ follower, say to this woman?
Well, my first thing I would say would definitely be thank you for just being on the front lines and for all the work that you're doing to really meet people where they are in this place of physical need. I think that's important to acknowledge. The second thing I would acknowledge is that it is understandably stressful, anxiety producing and anxiety provoking. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that and to not pretend that those aren't real challenges and real issues that people are going to face, especially those that are on the front lines. So I think that I would also applaud you for naming that already and for acknowledging it, and would encourage you to continue to seek out people that you can talk about that with. So one thing that we've done at Yale in particular in the psychiatry department is to have daily town halls where people are able to join in by Zoom and talk about things like stress and resilience. There are also things that people are trying to do to really meet the needs of nurses and physicians who are on the front lines, to give people a place to talk and work through those things, because these are definitely stressful and challenging times with everything that's going on. The third piece I would say is, as hard as it might be, and this is a challenge, is also to be able to build in routines as much as possible, especially for those that are on the front line. There are things that can become challenging during this. People might not be sleeping as well, but if people are able to at least maintain some routine in terms of their exercise habits, their eating habits, their sleeping habits, that can go a long way. But also to be open to talk to a professional if those things become debilitating and maintained, because this is really, the work that you're doing on the front lines is very taxing. And I think that's something that we're all going to have to reconcile even after COVID has passed, because especially for those on the front line and for others, I think there are going to be mental health challenges that continue to emerge after the fact that we all need to be attuned to.
Yeah, I was in a conversation today with a pastor who was out in Manhattan after 9/11, and asking him, what's your counsel to I don't want to compare my situation at all to 9/11 in Manhattan, but what's your counsel? And he said, yeah, 3 to 4 months in, we were all depressed. We felt we had energy. It was almost manic. We're doing everything we can. We're trying to help people go because that's what was required. And then everybody got depressed.
Yeah.
So, well,
yeah.
I did not get to all of the questions, but
Totally.
we asked you for an hour. Thank you. Thank you for your work. God's blessings upon you as you navigate all the opportunities that come with being a neuroscientist and a professor and a medical school professor and a researcher. So we appreciate your time tonight, Dr. Addy. And as I noted, we're going to send out an email to everybody who was registered, and you'll get some contact information for Dr. Addy. By the way, I suppose this is a question, and there's probably an obvious answer. I'm probably not as cool as Lecrae, And you're hanging out with
It's a cool, I don't know about that.
okay, well, yeah, okay. Now that just means you got no credibility in my A minor class. So, okay.
You're in your own unique way.
Okay, yeah. I'm sure that'll play well with my boys. Okay. Well, thanks for being here tonight. Thanks everyone. Again, sorry if we didn't get to your question. God's blessing on everyone. Let's encourage one another to love and good deeds.
Amen. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here, and I hope this has been useful for all of you that have been watching and tuning in. I really appreciate all the questions, and hope this has been something that God can use to really encourage you all and help you to reach that place of wholeness in your lives.
Great. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.